Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature, with deep gratitude to all our ancestors, all the generations before us that have brought us to the present moment, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on day 2 of a 5-day program on the crisis and challenge to democracy in the United States. Knowing that democracy is under assault, literally, worldwide, under the threat of rising authoritarianism. As I was preparing my thoughts for the session, I came across an observation of Voltaire that I want to bring in, given the fact that we are in our situation. He said that if you can get a person to believe in absurdities, you can get them to commit almost any atrocity. There's a relationship between the big lie of the 2020 presidential election and the atrocities that are being committed right now by Donald Trump and his cohorts in the Republican Party to dismantle democracy as we know it. The state of mind and the ability to engage in egregious activities are two sides of the same coin. Worth contemplating. Before we dive into our discussion today, let us pause as we always do as we commence our Humanity Rising sessions, and let us just relax into our bodies, our nature. Let us close our eyes if we can and center ourselves in our hearts. And for the next minute, in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving, just align yourself with your heartbeat and feel love and compassion for everyone on this broadcast and all the people around the world that are working so urgently to protect democracy as we know it. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our conveners, George Cappannelli, the founder and CEO of Age Nation, who is passionate about democracy, and John Steiner and his wife, Margo King, who are networkers par excellence, also passionate about democracies. George, John, welcome to Humanity Rising, and I turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks very much. John and I are happy to be here today. We couldn't agree more with Voltaire. There's another quote. It's about curiosity. It says that curiosity is a cure for boredom, and thankfully there's no cure for curiosity. And it would be really wonderful if there were more people in the United States who valued curiosity and were willing to dig in and look at reality as it exists rather than as so many of them today are pretending. Three terrific guests today. I'm going to introduce our first guest, who's only going to be able to be with us for a short period of time. Stephen Olikara is the founder and former CEO of the Millennial Project, a great organization that has raised millions of dollars to support state and congressional candidates and people that are doing the really significant work of keeping democracy alive. And Stephen's somewhat of a rare bird in that he's now also running for the US Senate in Wisconsin. He's a very loyal Wisconsinite, the son of immigrant family from India, also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. And here on Humanity Rising, we as a number of people believe that Stephen is one of the true bright lights in the political canvas. And we're quite certain that we're going to see and hear a lot from Stephen over the next several decades. And if not, we're going to give him a really hard time. I just want to know that. So, Stephen, really, welcome again to Humanity Rising. And tell us where you are in this rigorous campaign in Wisconsin.
Hey, George, let's bring Dylan and Eleanor in.
Oh, all right, sure.
So Eleanor and Dylan, welcome this morning. I will do brief intros. Eleanor was with us several months ago when we had Jenna Griswold on. And Eleanor, we're looking forward to hearing a lot more from you about Secretary of State's, and we'll say more about you a little later in the hour. And Dylan is a last minute show this time. Turns out that he and Maggie Oliver are both PhD students, and Maggie Oliver happens to be the Secretary of State in New Mexico, which is how they met and how she invited him, having heard a little bit about him, to be her campaign manager. They are also connected because they both are trivia experts. So Dylan is doing his PhD on disinformation, and we'll hear more about that as well. So Stephen, please, over to you to start today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, John and George, Jim, and everyone. It's truly an honor to be with all of you. I love the vibration of this convening, which I think speaks to the awakening that we need in our politics. When I think about the four key words of this gathering itself, humanity rising and democracy dialogues, those words represent my mission in politics and why we're running this campaign for the US Senate. And as George mentioned, we're running a vigorous campaign that is a new politics, searching to call on the better angels of people as opposed to the easy road, which is just appealing to the darkest impulses in human behavior. And when you do that, you get the opposite of centering humanity in our politics. What would happen if you actually elevate a dialogue in our political conversations that recognize our common humanity, that recognizes the dignity that all people deserve? And if you do that with a sense of curiosity and humility, you do truly have the chance to lift people up. And if you wonder, well, that sounds like a political revolution, where does that idea come from? For me, it comes from jazz music. My first passion in life, growing up here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was playing music of all genres, but the one that spoke to me most was jazz, that spirit of openness, of being fully present and live with people. And when you bridge divides and have an open conversation, you're not necessarily meeting in the middle, you're meeting on a new playing field altogether. So that's a little bit about what our politics is all about. And here in our campaign, we are attracting what I call the exhausted majority. Maybe some of you feel like you're part of the exhausted majority as well. People who are disillusioned and disaffected by the status quo, mainstream establishment politics. And you might be a Democrat, Republican, or independent, but you believe that we need to be united in our protection of democracy. That's the audience we're speaking to here. And that, frankly, is a kind of political movement that most are too afraid and don't maybe have the courage to pursue. But I believe it's urgently important and needed right now. Now we're at an important inflection point, and George, should I talk about the debate right now, or should we save that for later?
Oh, no.
Oh, get right to it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Well, let's dive right into that. So, look, when you're running a campaign that's calling people to a higher order of politics, you have to recognize that people are still often, a lot of the institutions and the systems are still operating under the old order, and there are going to be systemic barriers along the way. Now, we've overcome each of those on this campaign trail so far, and I'm proud recently that we made history here in Wisconsin, elevating the first ever Asian, South Asian, Indian American, the first ever brown person to a US Senate ballot here in the state. And for people who are less familiar with this is this race to replace Ron Johnson, who's one of the biggest threats to our democracy today. Now, just as we were making history, we heard from our local media outlet, the NBC affiliate TV station, that they're finally going to have a debate. This might shock many of you, but there's so far been 0 debates in this campaign because there is a interest in protecting the establishment Wall Street candidates who are not prepared to debate and frankly wouldn't fare well in those situations. So they want to keep flooding the system with millions of dollars of big money. They're not an exaggeration. There's a son of a hedge fund billionaire from New York.
Stephen, these are your opponents in the Democratic primary that you're talking about.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, these are Democratic primary opponents who are operating in a way that's actually undermining democracy right now. In fact, there was one debate scheduled, and the establishment big money candidates all declined to participate, and they actually canceled that debate. But finally, there's going to be one coming up next month. But then here's what the local media outlet said. They said, you need 5,000 individual donors to be on the debate stage. Totally unprecedented, this has never been done in Wisconsin politics in any type of analogous race. And they let us know about that just a couple weeks ago, which was later than they actually notified the other establishment candidates. So this is very much an attempt to silence our movement. And it's very much recognizing that every time we're on the campaign trail, interacting with real people, we light it up, and they want to make sure that we don't have that kind of larger platform for people. So look, we cannot feel discouraged by this. There have been systemic barriers of suppression since the beginning of this country. Our job is to overcome them. And so one way that we can be part of breaking those barriers is every single person on this Zoom donating $1 or $3 or $5 to this cause to get on the debate stage. We need that by June 30th. And you can go to stevenolikara.com/debate to help us get on that stage, because we know once we get there, then it's an equal platform. You've got a microphone and an audience, and that's exactly what we've been asking for this entire time. And we have the chance to share this vision for a politics that centers our common humanity and dignity. So we're excited for that and would love your help.
Stephen, how many donations do you have so far, and how many, therefore, do you need?
Yeah, so we've crossed the halfway mark, so we're about 60% there. So I believe we are closing in on about 3,000 right now, so we probably need another 2,000. We have some of our biggest endorsements coming out this week, so stay tuned for that. But like we are deploying every resource we have available to us over these next 2 weeks, because we know we have the competitive advantage on that debate stage.
So say the website one more time.
Yes, it is stevenolikara.com/debate. And I can, thank you, Diane. I see your note in the chat that you've already donated. I'm adding that in right there, stevenolikara.com/debate. And again, any amount qualifies in this case. You can be in state, out of state. as long as you're able to donate to campaigns. As a U.S. citizen, green card holder, and 18 years old or older, you're able to donate.
And it's STEVEN, as we see on screen, for those of you who aren't on chat today and are going to be hearing this either live or recorded. And then
And I see another gentleman from Martin Cupper also just donated. So let's keep it up. Let's just make this a reality.
and please, everybody listening, if you're so moved, share this with your lists. This is how it's going to work. You're running a grassroots campaign, and this is a grassroots fundraising effort as well.
So Stephen, talk a little bit about how you're viewing what you see going on on the political scene. A little later, we're going to get more deeply into the struggles that secretaries of states are having and the whole legislative boondoggle that's going on with MAGA candidates running to, as they did in New Mexico earlier this week, refuse to certify. But what else do you see that we, the people, need to do to make a difference?
Yeah, I see a confluence of forces here that are extremely powerful. You've got money, you've got tribalism, and you have hate going on all at the same time. And when you put those three things together, it becomes extremely profitable, not only to divide our country, but to have this winner takes all mentality. And this is something that George Washington predicted in his farewell address when he said that extreme factionalism would lead to the rise of authoritarian tendencies and foreign corruption and influence. Because what he was predicting is that in human behavior, when you start to see the other side as not just different, but fundamentally evil, you can justify a lot of horrific actions to squash the other side in the preservation of your own side. And so part of what I've seen working directly with members of Congress, and thanks again to everyone who's donating right now, through Millennial Action Project, which is a political movement I ran for the last decade, it brought together young members of Congress. And so I got to be in the room when a lot of decisions were being made, and I learned a lot too. And one thing I saw was most members of Congress, even if they are good people and have good intentions, they're operating under a corrupt and broken system right now. And money is at the root of that. It's, if you want to stay in office, you have to keep, raising money just to even get on certain committees. And that's why I've made my number one piece of legislation in the US Senate, getting big money out of politics and restoring integrity to our election system and ending a lot of the legalized bribery that's going on in Congress. So when you have these types of forces, then that's what's going to result from that is a situation like January 6th, where we did not have a peaceful transition of power. And that's just a preview of what's to come if we don't enact some real structural political reforms and we don't elect real change agents and bridge builders to our politics who are willing to defy all of the odds. I was asked recently at a Juneteenth celebration this past weekend, what's the biggest difference with your campaign? Why should we vote for you? And I said, I'm prepared to lose my job over doing what's right. That's the biggest difference. If you have people who just only care about power, they're going to rationalize bad behaviors. If you care about people who care about, if you vote in people who care about principle over power, and who are willing to strike out and do what Bobby Kennedy said, unleash these ripples of hope, even when it's politically inconvenient, that is a movement whose time has come, and that's the biggest difference with our campaign. And so I feel called on a moral level to be doing this work and to do this campaign, and we just appreciate your help to stay out there and get on that debate stage.
Eleanor, do you have any questions or comments you want to make with Stephen?
Yes, Stephen, I admire your courage in running. I know it's always a hard thing, but in the current climate, it's extremely difficult, and not aligning with kind of the mainstream sentimentalities, you've got an even tougher race. But I admire your confidence in the American people and the voters, and I admire you bringing a fresh perspective into the race. I'm wondering, as someone who's so aware of all the challenges we face right now in politics and government in the United States, what do you think is our greatest challenge, and what do you think the average citizen could do about it? I know you mentioned money in politics, but is that in fact our greatest challenge, and what can the average person do about it?
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. And just building on what you said, I do have confidence in the people, and having now done over 150 events around the state in red and blue and purple areas, in communities where they've never even seen a brown person before in real life. I mean, it gives me so much confidence in the movement that we're building, in the ways that we've just been welcomed. And I have utilized music as a bridge to connect with people. I've played many renditions of Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire in rural Wisconsin, just as an example. But to answer your question, Eleanor, I think, I really think the biggest challenge right now is structural reform. And it's not only money in politics, it's really taking on the challenge of our primary system, where you only have a very narrow slice of people voting, and then you wind up choosing between the lesser of two evils in the general election. And what that really causes is, let's look at an issue like gun violence prevention. There are solutions that 90% of Americans support. We continue to have these tragedies where kids are getting shot, and you wonder, can our political system respond to this? Well, you cannot talk about the inaction on guns without talking about, first, money in politics. Ron Johnson in our race has taken over $1.2 million from the NRA, but you also can't talk about it without discussing the need for open primaries, because senators, especially Republicans who might be resistant or afraid of working on this issue, even if they privately want to reach across the aisle, politically they can't, because they're afraid about their primary challenger. Mm-hmm. And like I said, the founding fathers hoped that there would be enlightened people who run for office, and I've personally met a lot of good people in office. But the reality is most people, even if they're good, are not going to have that kind of courage to say, I'm going to take myself out. I'm going to commit political suicide to do what is right. Now, I'm ready to do that, as I said earlier, but most people I've met in Congress are not. And so that, I think those are the structural issues. And what can people do about that? I think, for one, I think it's all about starting with small steps and building up to bigger steps down the line. I think small steps that you can take are, putting in 1 hour of volunteer time into a cause or group that's trying to enact these reforms, or a campaign like ours that's pushing these reforms. I'm the only candidate in the entire Senate race on either side of the aisle that's calling for ranked choice voting and open primaries to help attack that issue. Now, another thing people can do is spread the word with their networks. We have so much power in our hands with social media. So if you send out a call to all of your followers on social media saying, something about our campaign, for example, or the need for structural reform, that's an important thing. And then the final thing is, vote with your dollars too. You can, what most politicians are responding to right now is money. And so if you're directing, $1, $3, or $5 to a political movement that is about what's right and what we need in our politics, then you're going to see many more politicians move in that direction.
Dylan, what about you? Do you have any questions or thoughts or encouragement for Stephen?
No, I really am honored to share a panel with you to learn about your candidacy, Stephen. I also just gave you $5, so don't spend it all in one place. But I'm interested in, this idea, and you brought it up towards the end. There's this logic in the political academic field of collective action and getting over collective action problems, which is why we have government. But as it relates to social media, I kind of wanted to know, without getting too much into the weeds, as a millennial candidate who is frustrated with the traditional media and the sort of barriers that they're placing on your candidacy. I'm sorry, it's mailman time for my dog. So I wanted to know what your social media strategy was, just in a nutshell, to overcome this, what I seem to be an undue barrier for your candidacy.
Well, we've utilized, first of all, we've got a number of 20-year-olds who are helping with our social media. So that's one step in the right direction. But we're across the board, and definitely encourage everyone, whether you're on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, or Instagram, any of those platforms, follow us at Stephen Olikara, because we've started to understand really how these algorithms work. And sometimes the algorithms do not work in favor of humanity, and we're all very aware of that. But at the same time, we've figured out, if you do certain things in terms of not only followers, but commenting, and, you're able to get into these social media algorithms and get a lot more people to pay attention to what you're saying. So that's been a big part of what we're doing. We're doing a lot of live conversations with people and just showing people the actual campaign trail. Here's another shocking stat. There have been over 50 multi-candidate events on the campaign trail across Wisconsin that include all of the major candidates, including myself, which I love, because that's the closest thing to a debate we've had, where you have side by side all the candidates, again, microphone, audience, and then you just share what's in your heart. And there have been media has been present at 0 of those. And so you wonder, how can the wider public even know what their options are, or know what actual campaigning involves, if the media is not present there? So what we do to combat that is bring social media into it. We will just tape live, what we're seeing on the campaign trail, and encourage our followers to share that. And that's been, I think, very effective.
Stephen, I know you have limited time with us today. So what is that spark that you have? Where does that spark that you have come from? What keeps that spark burning inside of you?
It's a good question. I was just asked that the other day at an event in Waukesha, Wisconsin, too. I've really, about 10 years ago, I had a deep reflection on my life. It was after reading my favorite novel, which is The Alchemist. And some of you maybe have read The Alchemist, and it talks about when you walk in your purpose, the universe starts to conspire for your success. But to find that purpose, you usually have to take a leap of faith into something that feels either risky or uncomfortable or inconvenient. And that was the spirit that led me to found the Millennial Action Project. And it was the same spirit that led me to launching this US Senate campaign. And I realized that, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at human history on a larger scale, one, you realize just how rare it is that a democracy exists, much less a diverse democracy that has people of every racial, ethnic, religious, and other types of backgrounds seeking to create a society together. This is like a blip, in the course of human history. But then you also realize just, how short our lives are too. And so I was thinking, if my life is going to be meaningful, it's going to be because I created a spark that other people could then build on. I was the, sort of the inventor in the garage that had the crazy idea that we can center humanity and dignity in our politics, and that we can reframe a whole set of issues as not left versus right, but future versus the past, and unleash a pro-democracy movement in the Midwest. If I could just create that spark and create some organization around that, that will be a platform for many more efforts to build on it. And I felt, some of you are familiar with the documentary film I was a part of called The Reunited States. And if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. It's on Amazon Prime. It's free on there. Again, The Reunited States. And it follows a few bridge builders in politics, including myself. And they were very intent on interviewing my parents, who are not public people at all. But eventually, after a year of prodding, they did agree. And we taped a scene of us having breakfast together. And my dad said something that really stuck with me. He said, when your time is up, you want to be able to look back on your life and say, you did something that was meaningful. And so I just have this, I guess, longer term perspective on where I can be of greatest service. And I think that's what really keeps my spark alive. And when you look at life as, not just what you can be, but what you can do, what kind of cause that's larger than yourself that you want to serve, it really kind of keeps things in perspective. So, as we've got all of these barriers, all of these, politics is it's not a newsflash to anyone here. Politics is very corrupted, but there are moments of real light in politics. And, despite all of those forces, I just keep the North Star in mind every single day. And, just being amongst all of you right now, is very meaningful too on that journey. So I'm very grateful for that.
Stephen, thank you for that. It takes a village. I remember when I met you before Millennial Action Project was really out there, in part because somebody who I knew and loved believed in you and gave you a space to work, namely John Marks with Search for Common Ground, which he's done with other people, including Rob Fursh of Convergence. But I also just want to acknowledge the folks that recognized you early and helped make it possible for you to do what you're doing. And not only are you paying it forward by who else you're recognizing, I think you're attracting other people who recognize you and want to help build a stronger platform. And I look forward to continuing this conversation, win, lose, or draw, after the primary, to see where this movement goes. And as George is saying, where your leadership goes. So we'll have you back on again, hopefully before the November election, and may there be magical surprises.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. And you were definitely one of those people early on who believed and opened doors. And I think no movement happens with one person. It's a lot of people who are willing to believe in it too. And I'm deeply grateful for all of those early mentors who helped open those doors. Some of you may have heard of an astrophysicist named Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I one time had a chance to meet. And he said this great line that, anyone in a position of leadership who's not bringing along the next generation with them doesn't deserve to be in that position in the first place. And I'm grateful to a lot of people who helped me along the way. And now it's my calling to be able to pay it forward, including on this campaign. I'm the only candidate who's actually put forth a young leadership agenda. And I've made a commitment that in the US Senate, I'll be hosting a conference on young leaders who want to enter public service, so I can help train, mentor, and network them to have opportunities and enter public service themselves.
Well, we look forward to seeing how this exhausted majority movement moves forward.
Yeah. Keep the faith, Stephen. Keep the faith. And we will talk to you soon. Huh?
Excellent. Thank you all very much. I truly appreciate all the support. And please reach out if you have any ideas, questions. Again, social media is at Stephen Olikara. And again, that link to help us get on that debate stage is StephenOlikara.com/debate. And look forward to keeping in touch with all of you.
Stephen, on that website, do you have a little temperature gauge of how close you are to the 5,000?
We are actually planning to put that up this week, so you'll see that very soon.
All right, day to day. We only have 9 days to get you there.
Absolutely.
Good luck.
And we will get there. We will get
Yes, you
there.
will.
We've crossed every barrier so far, and this is just the next one, and we will do it. So thank you. All right, take care.
Blessings. So before we go forward, I get introduction to Eleanor, my dear old friend. And Eleanor, I just want to say a little more about you before we jump in. You and I go back a long time, but your passion has been what's working and what are solutions, whether it's healthcare or education or what you're doing now with secretaries of state, which we'll let you talk about. But your passion, as long as I have known you, for democracy. And you're still considering running for public office in your beloved state of Massachusetts when you're not cheerleading for the Red Sox. So I just want to bring more of you into this conversation as well. And, you know, George, do you have a good leading question for us to continue here? And or do Eleanor or Dylan want to just say anything in response to what we've heard from Stephen?
Let's start there with Stephen, and then I want to know from each of you what is that thing that keeps that spark or fire inside of each of you alive, and why are you doing what you're doing? So Stephen first, and then next.
Why don't I? How about I jump in, since John did such a beautiful introduction there. So I am deeply motivated to help the United States right now. I love our country. I love the idea of America. I love that we're the gathering spot for people from all over the world, from all views and races, religions, coming together. And up till now, most of the time, living in relative harmony with each other. And it's scary for me to watch what's happening. I come from Massachusetts, which I consider the birthplace of the United States. All the great American revolutionaries there, the first battle there in Lexington and Concord. And I am deeply troubled by the ascendancy of Donald Trump. And not only him, because you tend to get autocrats are there all the time, but the fact that he's built so much support within the Republican Party and among the American people. And I think our greatest point of vulnerability right now is with the secretaries of state who control the machinery for voting. So I'm very concerned. I used to be Assistant Secretary of State in Massachusetts. I know what it takes to run these elections, and I know they can be sabotaged. If people get a hold of the statewide machinery, they can, with the intent to undermine it, they're able to do it. And that's my greatest concern. I know we can talk more about it, but I just thought that might help set the stage for Dylan, who's in the heat of the battle right now, working on a Secretary of State race at a time when there's an orchestrated attempt by election deniers to take over state machinery and bend it not to the voters' will, but to their own will and what they want to see happen. So over to you, Dylan. What's it like in the front lines?
Oh boy, what a loaded question. No, I think Eleanor, you nailed it on the head. There's a lot of the things that motivate me as well. I guess kind of a brief introduction to who I am. I kind of have a foot in both doors in both the applied work. So I manage one of our incumbent Secretary of State races, but I'm also, and I like to call myself an aspiring epistemologist, and I'm a PhD candidate in political science. I study political behavior specifically. So, and within that, to get more specific, I study human information processing. So I'm interested in why people believe certain things that are patently false. A lot of that, without getting too into the weeds, a lot of that has to do with identity and identity protective cognition, which effectively layers every bit of information that you come into contact with and determines whether you take the veracity of it, or whether you just throw it out and keep on the way that you were heading anyway, and towards the conclusions that you want to make. But in terms of, running a campaign against our opponent, who the other day was mentioned on John Oliver for some of the outlandish things that she said. She's a full-on election denier. And I don't know, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. The people watching might have seen my boss, Maggie Toulouse Oliver, our incumbent Secretary of State, in the news for suing one of our county commissions down in southern New Mexico, which is actually home to this all comes full circle. Couey Griffin, who you guys might have heard of, he's the Cowboys for Trump guy that was actually sentenced in the January 6th Capitol riot insurrection. So, he's one of the commissioners out there. He admitted on video that he didn't have any proof to not certify his county's elections, but he was going off of a gut feeling. And I felt that situation, it was a weird marriage of my academic and my sort of practitioner life of, here are a group of people that are just deep in the trenches of this, what I like to call the US and I think Western democracy's epistemological crisis going on. I don't think that we have consensus on what truth is anymore. And I think that there are a group of nefarious actors that are exploiting that. And I think that those folks down in Otero County and specifically on that commission, had they not been threatened with criminal prosecution by my boss and our state attorney general, they wouldn't have certified, and it would have sent our democracy in New Mexico off a cliff because none of those people would have ended up on the general election ballot. So, I think if anything, what I'm learning about this situation is that increasingly the threats to our democracy, the breakdown, the backsliding, if you will, are increasingly localized. And the fight now, while we're watching what happened nationally, of course, 2 years ago, or oh man, what is it, coming up on 3 years almost with the January 6th, or 2 years, excuse me, the January 6th stuff, that's the national attack on our democracy. But anymore, it's happening on the local level. And those folks that were at the attack are running for office. And what's even more troublesome is they're gaining traction and they're raising a lot of money and they're building robust coalitions that we need to take seriously. My opponent alongside, Jenna Griswold, who is the Secretary of State in Colorado, as well as the candidate in Nevada, his name is Cisco Aguilar. They're all running against election deniers that are part of this coalition. I believe it's called the America First Coalition that was started by the My Pillow guy, which is just like absurd to think about. But I don't take anything for granted this race. My boss, my client right now is extremely popular. She's extremely well versed in those things. She's the president of NAS, which is the oldest bipartisan organization in the country, the National Association of Secretaries of State. She's just got a lot of experience, and we're just trying to campaign on that and try to make clear to voters that the threats to our democracy, unfortunately, it's not something that moves voters. It moves activists, it moves progressive folks, but the people that turn out on election day, they're not voting based on who they think is the bigger threat to democracy. They're voting based on who can make their lives better and provide good governance. And so that's the case that we're making. Of course, we're cognizant of the realities of the situation, but at the end of the day, we have to make the case on how this is going to affect everyday lives, which is where I get the opportunity to talk about what would happen to voting if these folks were in, and how all of their votes would be disenfranchised simply based on feeling, no evidence. So kind of a long-winded answer. I hope I covered my bases here, but I'm happy to build off of that for sure.
So
Thanks, Dylan. I just am amazed that we're existing in a time that I also begin to see a lot of ads for a thing called leaky gut syndrome. And I think it's got something to do with all of these people who are going from their gut, that there's a disease in the gut that we need to get rid of. And the question becomes, what do we do? You're right, Dylan, and I know Eleanor and John also agree that unfortunately people don't support democracy. They support lower gas prices or whatnot. And the challenge is, how do we link the issues that concern them in life to what's going to happen if democracy is lost? Eleanor, John, Dylan?
I want to throw that back. That's exactly the question, George, I wanted to ask you, Dylan, because you're on the campaign trail. And we had this conversation yesterday with Zach Malamet and Raymond Contreras about who are leading a group called the Next 50 of young leaders running for office at different levels around the country. How does democracy basically become a bread and butter issue? And what's the linkage between democracy and bread and butter issues?
Yeah, great question. It's the question that keeps me up at night, wakes me up in the morning. I think a good way to demonstrate this is how we, Maggie and I are in the process of, lining up our endorsements from. I want to prioritize labor in our working families because those are the folks that, enjoy the sort of multitude of voting options that we have here in New Mexico. And the case here is that, our opponent has openly said they want to get rid of early voting. They want to get rid of no excuse absentee voting. They want to make, in the more absurd channel, they want to hand count all ballots and have them, done by 8 p.m. on election night, which is just like logistically impossible. But we make the case to our working families and to our folks that, if these folks get elected, they're coming for your ability to vote, and they're going to make it much harder for you to do that. And I think that is the sort of bread and butter thing that people care about is one, is voting easy? Is it accessible? Is it going to take me 5 or 6 hours just to vote? And the reality is the platform that these America First secretaries are running on, they want to strip all of those voter protections away. And so I make the case, and I tell Maggie to make the case that, the broader issue here is that they want to tear down our democracy. But the everyday issue, the thing that you need to care about is that they're going to make it harder for you to vote. I think that is the sort of strategy that we have. And, of course, depending on our audience, we shift it up. When we're in groups like this, or when I am, we can talk about the broader issues of our democracy. But when we're in front of folks that don't think about these things every day, they're thinking about feeding their family, they're thinking about going to work. We really try to relate it and talk about how these issues trickle down and are eventually going to affect them.
Eleanor, what about you?
Yeah, well, I go back to kind of the origins of the United States. One of the things I adore about our country is that in the American Revolution, we did not just reject King George. We rejected the idea of any king whatsoever. And we moved to the rule of the people. Now, of course, it was originally white male property owners, but we've gradually opened and expanded that franchise to include everybody. And what's happening now, even though to most people the concept of democracy is very abstract, I think the way we can tie it back in is to say, right now, we have a voice and a vote as an American citizen. If these people get in and get control of our election machinery, your voice and your vote will no longer matter. It won't count, and we'll revert back to a time of autocratic rule, whether the autocrat be a king or whoever's controlling the machinery will dictate how we live. And I think there's something compelling in the American spirit that even if we, half people don't vote anyway, if we're told we can't vote or we won't be allowed to vote or it's making it harder for us to vote, there's something in our spirit that could rebel against that and say, you can't take that away from me. I want my voice and my vote. Because whatever issue you care about, if you want lower prices on your gas and your food, if you care about the weather going crazy and the floods and the fires we've got, if you care about reproductive rights for women, whatever you care about, you won't be able to impact if we lose control of the election machinery to people who are hell-bent on distorting it to whatever they want to have be the outcome. So whatever your number one issue is, your number one concern is, your number two issue and concern must be our elections and our democracy so that you can retain your voice and your vote, the power as a citizen to speak up and to elect our elected representatives at the local, state, and federal level. If we lose that, we lose the United States.
Eleanor, as you're talking, and Dylan, as you're talking, it's just a brainstorm here. I wrote down big lie equals even higher gas prices equals lower wages equals worse healthcare equals worse climate equals abortion with a line across it. I mean, just thinking about what are the visuals, how can we get this down to what people might look at on a card or on a poster or on a billboard. So, I mean, again, I think I wake up with the same concerns you do, Dylan, about how do we translate what's going on to people who aren't reading the news, aren't watching the hearings. As Zach pointed out yesterday, the younger people don't watch television or cable news. And the January 6th committee has not done as good a job as they could have and should have of getting the word out in social media. So again, it's really tying back into your whole interest and knowledge around disinformation. And how do we change behavior? Because, we've seen that maybe we've gone from 10% of Republicans to 20% who no longer are buying into the big lie. But you're on the ground, and how do we continuing to translate this into votes for your candidate, but for candidates around the country who really have a chance to win this time around, to keep the Senate, to hopefully keep Congress, but also to keep more state legislatures, as well as secretaries of state. So I think I'm really just saying what you've already said, but does that bring out anything more that you're thinking about?
No, hearing you say all this, it makes me think that, the battle that we're having for our democracy isn't happening in a vacuum. And the unfortunate reality is because of the duopoly of the two-party system, it seems like there are so many negatives on the other side and so many positives on what I believe to be, the left or the our side, that it's hard to fully sort of capture what's happening and what the implications are. But I do think that, as we get closer to November and as people are putting more money into paid communications and talking about what's on the line, I think that at some point, people are going to realize that 50 years of precedent on reproductive freedom and justice is about to be stripped away. Our climate, my state right now is actually experiencing one of its largest wildfire in history. It would be a shame if Maggie, my candidate, didn't talk about that relationship between climate change and voting rights. She literally had to hold an election for displaced people because of a wildfire. You know what I mean? These things are all intimately related. And I think it's up to us. The onus is on, in this case, the Democrats and the more progressive folks to make the case that, it starts with democracy. And once we can agree that, on a simple set of facts, that after that, we can build out and really start to build this issue portfolio of, okay, what happens after we secure our democracy and secure our right to vote? Well, we have all these other issues that we need to look at now. And I really think that, people like to say this is our number one defining issue of our time. I think right now, the epistemological crisis that we're in and the sort of implications that it has on our democracy, if it goes the other way, we're never going to get it back. So to me, that is the number one issue. But, that's something that I continue to navigate every day, is how do you message this really sort of crisis level issue of saving our democracy to folks that, find it too nebulous or don't find, saving our democracy a reason to turn out to the polls, So I don't know. It's something. It is the defining issue, I think, and I'm curious to see what other campaigns are going to do to message on this.
Well, and I hope.
Well, I think it's, I'm sorry.
Let me just a follow-up question. What do you mean by an epistemological crisis for democracy?
Yeah. So and I encourage you guys, I can maybe find the link before I have to duck out to go actually do some stuff with Maggie. But, the other day, the Otero County Commission, one of the commissioners, Coy Griffin, I think this is like the perfect encapsulation of the situation we find ourselves. He said, no, I don't have any evidence to support this. No, I don't. I'm not basing this on any sort of fact that we've uncovered. I just don't believe that our election was not stolen. I believe it was fraudulent based on feelings. And I think that that is the best encapsulation of the situation we're in, where, there is no evidence that the 2020 election was swayed towards Joe Biden because of fraud. Nonetheless, it is guiding what they say in public. It is guiding public policy. It is, I wanted to talk to Stephen a little bit about Wisconsin was one of the first states that said that, if the state legislature didn't want to, it didn't have to certify the election. It can shoot its electors over towards whoever they thought the actual winner was. And I think that that is the sort of intimate relationship between, fact or fiction now, pouring into the realm of public policy. So when I say the epistemological crisis anymore, it's that we don't have a common set of facts. We don't have a common reality anymore. And, legislation and public policy begins from the standpoint that there is a real implication that we need to fix this. And so, they're gonna legislate from a fairy tale land, and the victim being our democracy wholly. So it's extremely troublesome.
So here's the story. I'm sorry, Eleanor.
Yeah.
We've been skirting a larger issue, for me anyway. And the larger issue is that we, the people, are asleep. The fact of the matter is, what we need to do as people, I believe, is wake up and recognize that this drama is being played out by a limited number of people in a relatively broken political system. Right now, the reason secretaries of state and individuals all over the country are struggling is because our Congress cannot and does not pass the legislation that would wipe all of this trash and nonsense off the ballot, that would eliminate all of the garbage that is being promoted and advanced by people who are trying to steal democracy. And that lack of ability to pass is dependent on two individuals who I consider to be fools in the Democratic Senate. If we were able to get the filibuster set aside, we could stop all this pain and suffering in America. So I want to know, where are we, the people, in getting into the streets and doing what we need to do? We march and we protest for every conceivable issue except the issue that can save democracy. And that issue is getting the filibuster set aside so that the John L. Lewis and other voting rights acts can be passed. Joe Manchin and our good friend from Arizona should not be allowed to hold up America. And we are not talking about that, in my opinion, enough. Where are we the people, and why are we not out in the streets bringing the process to a halt until those two fools recognize that they do not have the right to sacrifice democracy for their own personal agendas? That's the question I have to ask. And Jim, I'd like you to come back in and jump in on this conversation.
Dylan, you have to leave about now?
Yeah, I can stay for 10 more minutes.
Okay.
We had to push some things back, but I actually do have a comment for George, unless Jim wants to hop in. George, I agree. I think the filibuster is a stop, is a roadblock for anything substantive anymore. But I do want to also acknowledge that the structural disposition of the US Senate does favor Republicans, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but if you look at, middle America, and you realize that it's basically all red, represented by red senators, that's a sort of fundamental issue that I think the founders, did not anticipate. I don't think they anticipated 340 million people in the U.S. And I know that they, stressed the importance of protecting the minority at the expense of the majority. But if you look at the map, Democratic states represent about 120 million more people than red states.
Mhm.
I think I am all, and I do think that the founding fathers were onto something when they wanted to protect the minority and their opinions. However, I do not believe that, based on the situation we're in today, that should come at the expense of the majority. And I think that at that point we are living in a minoritarian democracy, held captive by a roadblock in the Senate or a sort of procedural rule. It's not anywhere in the Constitution. It's barely written in rule. I think that there are larger emblematic problems of the Senate, in addition to the filibuster, that we should also be talking about too. And I don't know, I'm not ruling out the idea that somewhere down the line, a constitutional amendment comes along that maybe adds more seats or does something to make those a little bit more level the playing field a little bit, because Republicans are just had such an advantage when it comes to the Senate, and because of the number of states that we have.
Yeah, and I would.
Before you jump in, Eleanor, go ahead.
Yeah, chime in. I agree that we should get rid of the filibuster. It's just a Senate rule, as Dylan said. It's not in the Constitution. It can be voted out as a rule. It's very anti-democratic in a way, because it requires so many more Senate members to support any piece of legislation. Having said that even if the current Senate got rid of the filibuster as its rules, the Voting Rights Act still would not have passed. The problem we've had with most legislation in the past 2 years since Biden has become, or a year and a half since Biden has been president, the problem has been 2 Democratic senators that blocked it. Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kristen Sinema were 2 senators who were not backing a lot of the legislation that Biden was trying to push through. So even without the filibuster, we would not have had the Voting Rights Act. We would not have had a lot of the other legislation. Still, I think we should get rid of it, but we can't blame everything on the filibuster.
I don't blame everything on the filibuster. I blame everything on we the people. I blame the fact that we are not making our will known. These individuals work for us. We pay their salaries, their retirement benefits. They should be responsive to us. And when they are not responsive, then we should exercise that vital and necessary right to assembly and protest, and we should bring things to a halt until they listen.
George, how do
They're
you
not exercising that privilege.
how do you propose we do that?
I believe that we get all of the activist and advocacy organizations in America who are committed to democracy together to form one voice that organizes one massive national protest I call Days of Resolve, in which the American people who support gun control, who support climate change, who support women's rights, who support all of these things, come together and say, I've had enough and no more. This ship doesn't leave the dock today unless you, who work for us, begin to pay attention and we call them out. The Manchins and the cinemas and other people who are stalling democracy in America. It is atrocious that 2 human beings should determine the fate of a nation. That is not what democracy is about. And it is time we call them for who they are and we galvanize the American people to stand up. Just like Peter Finch did in network, who said, go open your windows, step out of doors and say, I've had enough and I'm not going to take it anymore. We can't wait even for the midterms. The horse will have already left the barn. We need to act now and make sure that the midterms have a consequence that helps save democracy.
So George, I'm all for we the people rallying. I'm very concerned right now that at least 40% of the people in the United States don't have a problem with what's happening, and they believe the big lie and everything around Trump. I just, before Dylan leaves, I just want to circle back to something you said at the very beginning, Dylan. You're asking the question, why do people believe something that is so patently false, that has no evidence to support it, and yet they believe it to the point they will risk their lives to fight for this falsehood? What do you see, given both your experience in the field and campaigning and also your knowledge as a PhD student? Why do people believe things that are patently false, and how do we change that?
Ooh, good question. How long do we have? I guess putting my academic hat on, I mean, the politics of identity, and what identity does for people on a human level, it's well documented in psychology. But what's really interesting to me in the last like 30 years, we really started to look at what that looks like in terms of political identity. And anymore, and on some surveys, you can find folks that identify with one of the two parties, you know, potentially even stronger than they identify with maybe their race or ethnicity, or even sometimes their gender. So partisanship is an identity that people develop over time. And so what that does, and getting into a little bit into what my research is specifically, what identity ends up doing is it acts as a filter, kind of like my glasses here. Imagine this was my identity. Everything that I see, everything that I perceive through this filter, then influences, it goes in, and I determine based on my identity whether the veracity of information is true or not. And so, just on a practitioner level, now switching gears, I'm watching and I monitor the sort of far right movement in New Mexico and their efforts to sort of lobby all of these county commissions not to certify their elections, not based on evidence, but based on feelings and based on phony graphs and stuff like that. I've just watched them at least 6 or 7 times be presented with evidence that completely negates what they're hearing or saying, and they will find justification to believe it anyway. They'll say, well, that they're lying anyway. So not only are we in a situation where they don't believe basic facts, but they don't believe the traditional fact deliverers in our justice system, like the courts. The Supreme Court in New Mexico came down a writ of mandamus on the county commission and said, you have to do this. And here is why. Here's all of the statutes saying that there's precedent saying you have to do this. Well, these people are going to say, no, the Supreme Court's wrong. Here's what I believe. It's just they're totally attacking these fact-based institutions anymore. And so, back to your original question, I think just the politics of identity in general. And, I think that has been taught, that term has been tossed around by the left and the right in a sort of derogatory manner. But I think identity serves its function on a human level. And we're seeing this unfortunate reality where it's merging with a decentralized media market where you can find any news and any facts that you want to sort of affirm that identity to begin with. And it's a nasty sort of cocktail, if you will, of the psychology behind it, as well as the technological innovations that have enabled it. And so I hope I answered your question, Eleanor, but I think that for the most part, we're in a post-truth reality. And I think Al Gore nailed it on the head in the early 2000s when he started talking about this. And I don't think that we should be, so focused on the truth anymore as so much as, from a practitioner standpoint is just turning out our voters and, making clear the reality of what's going to happen if we don't. So I don't know. This is the great question, Eleanor, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I'm at a loss. I'm just amazed at my fellow Americans who swallow this garbage and have no evidence behind it and just are so certain that it's true. And I'm seeing this in my own family. My in-laws, which are very split. Some are sensible Democrats and others are just these, like, they live in a fantasy world and you can't even have a conversation because they don't agree that facts are facts. They have their own reality. So I don't see any way through that except the one thing that I heard was someone who studied cults. And how do you deal with someone who's been in a cult for a period of time and they're, kind of coming out of it? How do you deprogram someone who's been programmed to believe a bunch of lies? And the key that they found was not to say you're wrong or these are the facts and you don't have the fact, but rather to ask them questions that then ultimately help them. Something in there then goes, oh yeah, that doesn't quite compute. But just to keep asking them questions. But we don't have time for that. We've got these elections in 2022 coming up again in 2024 that are critical elections. So I think, yes, ask questions of any family members or friends who are kind of caught in this fantasy land of Fox Trump land. But our main work is to get people who are conscious and thinking and connected to facts, get them registered to vote and get them out voting in the biggest numbers possible. We did it in 2020 to elect Biden by 7 million more votes than Trump. We can do it again in 2022 and 2024, but it takes enormous amount of organizing work. That's what I think needs to be done.
Well, there's no doubt, Eleanor, that what needs to happen is to turn out the vote. That's an essential piece of this element. But what we just experienced in New Mexico, here in New Mexico, and what Maggie had to go through and the Supreme Court and Dylan had to do, that's going to come up big time when the votes are cast. So that's why I say there also has to be another element in this plan. There has to be a way that we, the people, demonstrate. 40% may be a number, but 60% is a stronger number. And if 60% of the United States, the citizens in this country, decide that they have had enough of this nonsense, I'm telling you, before the election, it will change a lot of minds and hearts, and it may very well allow some legislation to pass in Congress that can actually relieve some of this suffering. We cannot rely this time on the vote alone, because the vote has already looked at what's happened in 47 states. That vote has already been tampered with before each one of us casts one ballot. So we do have to go out in enormous numbers to vote, but we also have to find something else we can do. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time exploring that. And Jim, I'd like you also to come in and share. What have you heard? What are you thinking? What are you asking?
George, do you mind if I interrupt? I gotta bounce out in a few minutes, but I'd like to leave with some parting words as well as respond to something Eleanor said, if that's okay for the program.
Sure, please.
Okay. Thank you all. Well, thank you all so much for letting me join. This was great. I'd love to come back anytime you'd invite me. I think, Eleanor, I'd like to comment on something that you said, and that is, how do you get these folks to believe in reality anymore? And I think, the cult example is a great example, but anymore, And, I don't want to be misquoted here. So let me be clear. I'm not saying that these folks that have been totally inoculated and immersed in this realm of disinformation and misinformation and sometimes flat out conspiracy theories. I think that we need to treat it sort of like a mental illness and approach it with compassion, with patience, and a sort of understanding that these folks have been inundated, to some extent maliciously, for a political sort of objective and with a political objective in mind. I think that it's very easy for us to just start to hate these folks or to really be upset with them and sort of treat them like second-class citizens. But I think that, if we're ever going to truly rebound and start to build a healthy functioning democracy, we need to approach this problem and these folks from an area of compassion and patience in this. And I think that is an important sort of element to this that if we are to fully recover, we need to do. The other thing that I will say, and I started out as a comparative international relations scholar and ended up in an American politics field. But what I find especially troublesome and what I'd like to leave you all with, and especially people listening, is, kind of like Jim's quote at the beginning with Voltaire, where you can get people to believe absurdities, you can get them to commit atrocities. What that looks like, and this is empirical, this is evidence to support it. The minute that you have a populace and a sizable chunk of it that is starting to question the legitimate means of government and how power is transferred, the minute that they stop to believe in it, that they start to denigrate it, is also the minute that violence becomes a feasible alternative. And it starts to become normalized. I think that Senate candidate, I forget where, Eric Reitens or whatever, just something about shooting his Republican primary opponents. The Overton window has shifted here, folks. Like, this is not, raising the alarm. And this is something that I worry about as a practitioner, as somebody who manages a candidate who has had active death threats out on her following the 2020 election and to today. These folks are questioning reality, and it's eventually bubbling over into a justification for violence, and that is what especially is most troubling to me. So again, not to leave you guys with an awful ominous sort of tone before I leave, but Jim, go ahead. Sorry if it's responding to
Dylan,
me.
I just thank you so much for bringing this in. I just have one question before you leave, and I know you're pressed, but how has this reality affected how you're running the campaign? I mean, because, I ran for Congress back in the 1980s, late 1980s, and there was no big lie. You were trying to get your information out there. You were going for the independents. You were looking for the Republicans as well as Democrats, and it was a messaging, get out the vote. But it's like you're now dealing with a big rock in the middle of the playing field that, for all practical purposes, is unmovable. So how, as a campaign manager, how are you re-strategizing your campaign to account for what Eleanor, and others have just been talking about, and you yourself has just been talking about? I mean, I had no death threats. I imagine, Eleanor, you had no death threats when you were running for office, and Maggie's now got death threats. How are you calibrating that?
It's a great question. Also, one of the things that keeps me up at night, I think, on a day-to-day level, I have to put more thought into what her travel looks like. And, that's not unique to when you're managing or working for some executive. Executives deal with these things a lot. But what has really become normalized lately is, it's based on this lie. And it's based on this idea that my boss somehow manipulated votes and, added 100,000 votes to Biden's vote total. So she stole the election or something like that. I just have to put a lot more thought into our travel. I have to, I coordinate sometimes with local police departments as well as state police, which is something that she's never had to do before. And when we go down, we had events scheduled in Otero County where all this stuff went down, and where all the folks that are extremely mad at her because they've been inoculated with this disinformation. You have to really think about things and make sure that you have your head on a swivel, because the reality is all it takes is just one 10-second window of somebody, a nefarious actor, getting involved, and it changes lives. So it's not something that I anticipated. I knew when I accepted the job that this was going to be a thing, just because I understood from my academic background. But it's a heightened security risk, and I do receive security briefings on it. If we need to put a detail on her, we have those resources accessible to us. Thankfully, we have a very hospitable governor that is very understanding of that, who also gets death threats. And I think that there is a gendered component to this as well that I think that we need to talk about, and that is that women get more death threats than men. And I think that is a whole basket that I don't know if we have time to unpack. But I work for a woman candidate, and I work for an extremely strong-willed woman candidate who doesn't put up with the baloney that the people would have her. To put a button on it, Jim, great, thank you for the question. It just makes my job a little bit more stressful, and a little bit more. I have to be more conscientious on what her travel schedule looks like, and if we're going to be in any counties that are deep hostile towards her. So it's a new reality, politicking in a world of where political violence is becoming increasingly normalized, and it's, again, extremely troublesome.
Dylan, thank you so much for extending your time. and
Definitely.
offering the range of insights and really practical on the ground experience that you're sharing with us, and good luck.
Of course. Thank you all so much. You guys have a great rest of your day. Pleasure talking with you.
Good luck, Dylan.
So, I have a question for each of you. These conversations ultimately become circuitous in some ways, because we're all grappling with a deep love and intention for democracy. And each of us in our own way, I believe, are confused and troubled by some of the challenges democracy is facing. What my question is how long do you think we need to stay confined by the boundaries of a system that is clearly not working before we recognize we have to do something different?
Eleanor, you're the most politically seasoned amongst us. What would you say?
I would say, first of all, right now, the voting systems are working well. I mean, there was tremendous pressure put on them in the 2020 elections, and 72 lawsuits, deep audits and investigation. And what came out time after time was that the election systems themselves are pretty accurate and work really well. The danger we face is that when you get election deniers in charge of the machinery, they are trying to manipulate it and have it come out. They've tried it at the county level, and it's very dangerous to think they'd get a hold of the statewide machinery. But right now, just to assure folks watching this, our election systems run very well. And what we want to do is keep that going. The problem come obviously multiple problems, but the influence of money, the influence of misinformation by candidates, by elected officials, by news media like Fox News, the flood of misinformation in the social media, and this drive to violence is deeply concerning. I do want to flag this gender issue that Dylan put on the table, because really there's a concerted effort to drive out honest election officials by the election deniers with death threats, with all kinds of hostile actions. Jenna Griswold told me she's getting death threats all the week. Some man just pleaded guilty for threatening her life repeatedly. So it's a very real issue. The Brennan Center says 1 in 6 election officials has been threatened physically as they're trying to carry out their duties to keep the elections humming and honest. But and Jim, I think this is a much longer conversation. I'd love to see maybe Rian Eisler come, but talk about the problem we have is not just within the past 6 years or so, the appearance of Donald Trump on the political scene. This is a battle that has played out since before the ancient Greeks, when for thousands of years there was peaceful egalitarian societies in Crete and many other places for thousands and thousands of years. And then the Kurgans come in, the violent guys come in, blow the place to smithereens, set it on fire, kill the men, take the women as slaves, and boom, we've got an autocratic rule by force. And that battle has gone back and forth throughout human history in different countries and in different ways. And whenever women ascend to greater authority and position, there is always a backlash of authoritarian rule by men in the family and in the country. And we're seeing with the women's movement in the 20th century, the greatest rise of women to power possibly in history, and now a fierce backlash with Trump and what's happening now. But I think, Jim, I'd love to see a program on that centuries-long, millennia-long gender struggle that I think is very much in play right now.
Eleanor, you didn't answer my question. I love you dearly, and I appreciate you enormously, but you did not answer my question. How long are we supposed to pretend that the system, what worked in 2020 may very well not work in 2022 because of 47 states and the legislation that they have passed? So what I want to know is, how long are reasonable, intelligent, discerning, passionate, committed people going to continue to simply stay within the lines of a system that is not working? When are we going to decide we have to up the ante? When are we going to decide that we, the people, have to do something different?
Well, I would say right now we've got 5 months, and yes, legislation has been passed in most states that makes it harder for people to vote. The Republican effort to knock people off voter rolls, to stop the absentee ballot from being allowed, to limit the amount of time people vote, to limit the number of machines people can vote on. There is an orchestrated effort to make it harder to vote. But I would say for the next 5 months, our focus needs to be really 100% on making sure people register and do turn out within the current laws that there are in the states. And that is top priority. I do believe we can win even with the extra roadblocks put in place. If we find in those elections then that election deniers are getting a hold of the machinery, or people with guns show up to say we contest the correct election. They did it at January 6th at the national level to try and contest the duly fair election. It's very likely there could be people showing up to contest the fair elections that are being held in any of the 50 or many of the 50 states that we've got. So at that point, George, that's the point where I think we need to say, different ball game. We really have to come up with other strategies. But right now, I think we can still win. Our elections are free and fair, and our votes will be counted. We got to get people to turn out and vote.
Jim,
I think
go ahead.
I think Eleanor is making some very important points here about the integrity of the election system that stood the test in 2020 has been under assault for the last 18 months. And we'll see the degree to which it holds in 2022. But we're teetering on the precipice, the edge of the precipice, I would say. But I think Eleanor's got a good point. We're not over the precipice. And I think many people out there who aren't apathetic are in a sort of holding their breath. They're waiting to see how this next round will play out. But I would make, to answer your question, George, I would make 2 points in the spirit of Eleanor's larger Rianne Eisler contextualization. And Eleanor, we've had Rianne a number of times on Humanity Rising, but this is a good suggestion. I'm going to write her again and see if she'll come back, particularly on this issue of democracy, because she has such a powerful thing to say. The 2 points I'd bring in, that one that hasn't been brought in but is well known, but just to state it, it's the insidious influence of the evangelical Christians and the fundamentalists, the religious fundamentalists, because the delusionary sector demographic that is embracing the absurdities, as Voltaire said, are largely the evangelical Christians and the alt-right. So I just want to bring in the religious aspect of the people who are embracing the absurdities. And I'm a son of a missionary. I grew up with absurdity. And I know what it is. And my entire family, my 3 sisters, are still in the grip of it. And they're all militant Trump supporters. And they're all militant believers in the big lie. So I just wanted to bring in the religious aspect. And I think the other aspect of this is Fox News. We have a machine, a big lie machine that is probably the most well-funded broadcast network, maybe in the world, located in the United States, that is feeding this 24/7, 365, and there's no counterpart on the left of any significance in comparison to that alliance between the fundamentalist and the Fox News broadcasters. And so I think that's just something, and it's just worth noting that the biggest supporters of Hitler and the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s and until the end of the Second World War were the evangelical Christians in Germany. So this isn't unique to America. You find this in other countries and historically. The other point that I would make, which would be more historic, comes from Alistair McIntyre. And this is a specific answer to your question, George. Alistair McIntyre wrote a brilliant book called After Virtue, where he contemplated what is it like to be in a society that is post-virtue. We talk about post-truth, but it's also post-virtue. And he ends the book, his last page of his book, he said that it was during the fall of Rome that there was a bifurcation in the progressive community. Some believed that you could continue to reform Rome, and they went down with the ship because Rome at that point was so decadent, it could not save itself. The ones who saw the handwriting on the wall withdrew themselves from the prevailing system and set up monasteries. That was the beginning of the monastery movement. And the different monastic orders, to a large degree, were predicated on a political analysis that the imperium was no longer redeemable, and therefore they had to withdraw and begin to cultivate and curate goodness and virtue in another way. He says that the difference between that time and this time is that they understood the reality. We do not. And that constitutes our largest predicament, because we can't accept the fall of the imperium, because we're all in this delusional state of believing that America is the light on the hill, and so forth and so on, and we can't see it. So we keep spinning our wheels. And I think this is part of Buckminster Fuller. I think we're at a moment in time where the good people need to think very carefully where they want to put their energy, and whether or not, particularly if the 22 election goes as I think is largely expected and predicted, in preserving oases of goodness, like Humanity Rising. This is Buckminster Fuller. At some point, you've got to realize you can't reform the old. You've got to start the new. And I don't want to negate what the Stephen Olikaras are doing, or what Dylan and the people that are involved in politics. But I do think there's a larger framework now of the decline and fall of the American imperium that we need to talk about, and we need to acknowledge, and we may in November move beyond the point of no return, and that'll create some very stark choices in all of us in terms of how we spend our energy and what we do with our time. Many people that I know, for example, are contemplating leaving the United States and becoming expats. Others are withdrawing in certain ways, but still active, but choosing different modalities of expression. So I would say that's the moment we're in, but that's just my humble view.
So,
John,
Jim,
weigh in this, please.
well, Jim, I don't disagree with you, and I would go for that with one notable exception, namely climate change.
Yeah.
So because of that, those good people, I think, have no choice but to stay in the system.
Very good point.
So
Very
number
good
one.
point. Very good
George,
point.
I don't disagree with your wonderful soapbox. You've heard me say this before. I don't think there's a prayer that what you want to see happen has a chance to happen. And Eleanor, you pointed this out, until after November. And frankly, I think, and I say it directly, I think it's a waste of your time to keep putting out something theoretical when what we have to do is register people to vote, unless you want to lead a march in Santa Fe and get the media to cover it and have the posters and the signs that you're talking about, and see if you get any traction. Otherwise, I've spent decades of my life talking about what I want to see happen, there's a reality principle. It's not going to happen from my view of what reality is right now. And I think not only do we have to look at what you're talking about, Jim, I think we have to read the tea leaves. And the tea leaves show us that the best chance and the only chance we have right now are supporting those people who are registering others to vote, navigating the existing voter suppression laws, and then getting people to the polls. QED, that's it. That's the only game in town. The good news is the number of people in this country who are working at that level, whether they're lawyers, with a group called Protect Democracy doing everything they can to push back legally against what the states are doing, which is illegal, to groups like Movement Voter Project or Faiths United to Save Democracy, who we've had on, and countless others who are working beneath the radar, beneath the media. And there is a world out there that most people don't know about. And I think it's huge. And I think it offers the best chance of a surprise in the November elections. And what I'll add to that, Jim, with my own passion, is there's an extraordinary effort going on within the evangelical community, which we can't talk about yet because it's not public. But I think it has a chance to do what could be done to make a huge difference
Mhm.
in 2022. And I'm happy to talk about that offline. And as soon as we can talk about it publicly, we can have those folks
Let's have
even
them
if
on.
it's just one show and not have to wait until we do this again in September. And then for just the last point, I want to underline our dear friend, Stephen Olikara, StevenOlikara.com/debate. For those of you who are still listening and watching, he is the new kind of leader with the kind of movement, George, that you're talking about, and Jim and Eleanor, you're talking about. He's not
Yeah.
the only part of it, but he is a leader. And if we're going to get leaders from the women's movement, from gun movement, to all that's out there coming together to do, George, what you're talking about, I think 2023 is our year, regardless of what comes up with the elections, because we need a new constituency. And we've got bits and pieces that will elect the kind of leaders to do what we know needs to be done.
Okay, so I want to acknowledge each of you and recognize
God.
that from my perspective, it's an and, not an or. And I don't see enough of an and in things outside of just hoping and praying that the vote will turn out our way in November. I believe each American has an ability today to influence where we go in 2022 and beyond. We have an ability to influence with what we spend every day. Do we support companies that are opposed to the well-being of democracy, that are hurting the environment, that are supporting candidates that are in opposition to our well-being? Do we own stock in companies and are benefiting from the stock that we own that is subverting the well-being of America? Are we doing our share every single day, in addition to voting, to registering, to volunteering, and all of those things? For me, it's an and I don't wait for no man or no woman, nor do I hope that maybe if things turn out badly, there won't be martial law or there won't be further suppression of human rights after 2022. If the Republicans retain or regain control of the House and the Senate and more governorships, we need to act today to the very best of our ability with genuine consciousness and truth. And we need to start recognizing we have a hell of a lot more power than simply casting a vote in November. And
George,
that's what I would like to see a lot more of.
I don't disagree with you at all. And my experience is that we're going to fall prey to what has been one of the great American challenges and tragedies, namely the importance of the individual over the community. We, the people, to work has to be, I believe, at this point in our time, collective. Otherwise, we're not going to get the power and the force to do exactly what you want to say. And frankly, I don't think that level of organizing, because I think people are focusing on the elections, is going to happen sufficiently well and structured and fast enough between now and November. That's my difference. with
I
you.
understand.
I
I
don't-
just
I-
encourage people to
Every
read
one of us
the
should.
Declaration of
We
Independence.
could keep that this, whatever we know how to do.
I would like people to read the Declaration of Independence. What we are dealing with today is exactly what our founders dealt with 246 years ago. And they did not wait. They recognized that they were being called to play a higher game. They didn't sit on the sidelines hoping the good king was going to somehow or another melt away, or that the British were going to somehow or another become the good guys. They recognized that they were in a war for the survival of truth and justice and integrity and freedom and human rights. We are in the same war. So I don't say anything more than, please, let's make this an and, not an or. We don't have to sit in the sidelines for another 5 or 6 months, hoping and praying something's going to happen. We can influence that today, partly by doing the things that Eleanor and John have said so eloquently, part by doing things that Jim has said, and part by recognizing that we have a leverage, an economic leverage we are not using. And I pray that we start using it.
Eleanor and Jim, I'd love to hear your.
Eleanor, why don't you
thoughts.
give us a final word?
Both of you.
Well, I would say, George, I totally love your patriotic spirit and your call to action, and the stakes are high and there's lots we can do. I would say the number one job we have right now as citizens of the United States and of humanity is to register and vote ourselves, and register and vote every family member, every friend that we can rally to it. That is the call to action over the next 4 months. And the tie and connections among people who are engaged in that struggle now will, after the November 8th election, will be ties and connections that then we'll have conversations, some here and many all over the country, on what do we do next. And I think that is the time to focus on what else. But right now, it's like we're in a burning building. Let's try to put out the fire, and then we can have a conversation about what's next.
Jim?
Yeah, thank you,
And George-
Eleanor.
And George, thank you. I love your passion and spirit as well, as you well know.
And we're significantly over time, everyone. So I'll bring this to a close by just making a concluding remark to say that this dialogue that we've been having is democracy in action. And so we're grappling with huge issues that are unprecedented in American history. And we don't know really how to think about what's happening. And so therefore, we don't really know what the answers are that are going to make the kind of difference necessary to ensure the continuity of democracy. But I think, Eleanor, you're calling it. We have to do everything we can between now and November in every way to express our civic responsibilities. And George is right, it's multifarious. It's the choices about what you buy, what you eat, what you do, what you wear. And given that the electoral process is what's under assault, we've got to do everything we can to vitalize it. So like in 2020, it can withstand the assault. And if we can do that by November and at November, at the elections, we may have been able to stem the tide and slip through the eye of the needle in a way that would allow a democratic renaissance on the other side. That's my prayer. And one of the things that we've been doing at Humanity Rising is to talk about it. Just simply to talk about it. So George, John, thank you for convening the quality of people that you have. Again, This is democracy, folks. It's messy, but it's what's true. It's what's true. So thank you, everyone. That'll do it for today. You can join the after session chat group by clicking on the link in your chat box. And we'll see you all again tomorrow for day 3 of our democracy dialogues here on Humanity Rising. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye for now.